We believe in taking action and helping others do the same. So we are here to amplify the voices of our partners in this very important initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. And now Lydia Saluku Zograna.
Thank you. I'm Lydia Saluku, President for Pathfinder in Africa, and I'm here to talk and to highlight the voice of women.
Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Mithika Mwenda, you're not new to issues to do with climate change. Just tell us about yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is Mithika Mwenda, Executive Director of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. We are happy to co-host this event with the Standard Media Group. And for us, just top line is that we want to keep the spirit of the Africa Climate Summit and the road to COP, and what we want to pick on really what we are taking to Dubai. Yes.
And Charles, as we have this discussion now, it is an issue of media coming together with partners to make sure that this information actually gets there. Just how important is it for the media to get on board in this conversation?
I think it is extremely important because then media cannot work alone, and we also know that our partners need us. And indeed, it's the reason that the Standard Media Group has invested quite significantly in platforms that amplify the voices of society. And right now, one of the most critical issues is climate change. And what we have done is to ensure that anyone who has something to tell the world or to advocate around this very important subject has a place within the Standard Media Group assets. Critical is forums like these ones that will be continuous in a series. We also have shows that we are running both on KTN News and on our radio stations, Spice FM, Vibes FM, Radio Maisha, and Peru FM, and critically also on the KTN Farmers TV that deals specifically with climate smart agriculture. So the point is that we've created the platforms and we are inviting our partners to come on board and walk the journey with us, critically to give voice to the African agenda on climate change. Thank you.
Dr. Lydia, you say that you're big on gender issues, talk about the woman. Why is that so dear to your heart?
Very close to my heart, because when you talk about climate in our region, in Africa, I think most of the work activities women are doing is related also to agriculture, to, to forest, to fishing. And for me, it's really important. But what is important is also working on the health area. We see now that there is a change, in terms of access, because in some area, people need to move in terms of migration. And sometimes our systems are not ready to move with them. It's mean also we are losing some clients. And also working with health workers, we see that people are coming with new illness, and this is related also to climate. It's why for me, it's really very important. And when we are talking about health, we are talking about women. And for me, we cannot talk about climate without health. Health needs to be at the center of this discussion.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Now let me come to you, Mithika. The civil society has played a very integral role in pushing this agenda. PACJA is at the forefront on this together with other partners. As we sit here today and seeing you address heads of state at the Africa Climate Summit on our road to COP28, what should we be expecting?
So thank you very much, and that's why we are here today. Is really to give, to reflect on what really happened during the Africa Climate Summit, and whether we are still on track. Remember that the main outcome there was a statement and a declaration by the heads of states and African leaders and their partners on the top line issues which we need really to take to the COP. Most importantly for them was the priorities for Africa, the aspirations for the African continent, and the imperatives of climate justice. And these are, first and foremost, what is the status of adaptation and the global goal for adaptation, because adaptation is critical for Africa, for smallholder farmers, for instance, for women in Africa, for pastoralist communities in Africa, for everybody, because we are an agrarian continent. And so all the sectors which I mentioned, particularly in agriculture, are mostly impacted by climate change. When it rains, like they are flooding now, it affects the pastoralist communities, for instance. Look at what is happening in northeastern. There was drought, and after drought, you can see now what is happening. People are drowning in floods. These are the impacts, indicators of climate change. And so what are we going to get money there for adaptation? So that's question number one. Number two, we are transitioning. The transition is inevitable. So are we going to really transition justly? And who is going to carry that burden? Is that burden going to be transferred to the vulnerable people, the real victims of climate crisis? So that's another question. In Egypt, during the COP27, the key outcome there was the loss and damage facility for Africa. And that was the message we needed really to functionalize, to have it operationalized in COP28. The latest news we have actually is sad news, because now the developing countries wanted a standalone fund, but now this has been taken to the World Bank. If everyone knows the World Bank is not a very friendly institution for poor countries because of its policies, is not democratic, is controlled by a tiny minority of countries. All those issues are concerns which we are having to really to take there. But more importantly, the issue of climate finance. Are we going to get money or not? So these are some of the critical issues which are going to take there. But also the issue of procedural justice. Who is shaping the decisions at the COP28? Is it us? Is this fossil fuel companies? Is this who are we having our voice there? So these are the critical issues which are going to have there, and we hope we are going to pick the momentum of the Africa Climate Summit, which to our really disappointment is really going down.
Thank you very much, Mithika. And pertinent questions being asked. Are we the ones who are going to form the agenda at COP28, or is it the fossil fuel companies? These are discussions that we'll be having here a little bit later. A hand of applause to the lady and gentlemen here as we start planning on getting into our next session. But I just want to take note of Dr. Abraham Sing'oei, who is being represented. That is the Principal Secretary Foreign Affairs, and we have Martin Brouwer from the Dutch ambassador to Kenya, who's sent a representative as well. We have Caroline Vicini, Swedish ambassador to Kenya, has also sent a representative. Stefan Schonman, Denmark ambassador to Kenya, and Honorable Soipan Tui has also sent a representative. We take note of that. But then again, when Africa met in Nairobi quite literally during the Africa Climate Summit, there were discussions on what Africa must do as we go towards COP28. But how are we going there? Are we going there in a unified voice, or has our message been destroyed? As KTN News went to the fields to know exactly what our agenda is at COP28, let's just watch that live.
The climax of the three-day African Climate Summit, after what President William Ruto termed successful deliberations on Africa's position in the climate action agenda, songs of joy signaling breakthrough and consensus.
Africa Climate Summit is both a demonstration of the unwavering collective commitment of the people of Africa to their vision to make humanity's first home here in Africa a land of abundant potential, limitless opportunity, and the possibility of shared prosperity.
7 declarations were adopted unanimously from the summit that included commitments by the private sector, the children, the youth, governments, civil society groups, and the indigenous people. The clergy was not left behind.
Call that you accelerate meaningful and impactful sustainable development project and benefit sharing. Establish Indigenous Peoples Climate Resilience Fund to accelerate the realization of sustainable development goals and to mitigate against the impact of climate change on Indigenous peoples, in particularly women, children, youths, and persons with disability.
We as people of faith that are often the first respondents in crisis situations, including the ones that are caused by climate change, are wrestling with the question whether there is honesty and truthfulness in the entire process of negotiation.
Those who have caused the climate crisis to honor their commitment by deeply cutting their emissions, because that is where the biggest problem is, and ceasing from transferring the burden of action to the victims of their actions in the name of forced solutions to climate change.
The delegates committed to develop and implement policies, regulations, and incentives aimed at attracting local, regional, and global investment in green growth and inclusive economies. Meanwhile, delegates at the African Climate Summit have called upon the global community to act with urgency in reducing emissions, fulfilling its obligations, keeping past promises, and supporting the continent in addressing climate change.
The declaration we make to the world today defines and amplifies the African position on the way forward in climate action and the fundamentals that the international community must attend to in order to ensure that humanity's economic and ecological imperatives are effectively, coherently, and sustainably achieved.
As the African Climate Summit comes to a close, all eyes will now be on the industrialized nations if indeed they'll honor the $100 billion compensation on loss and damage, which will go a long way in boosting Africa's green energy transition agenda. Purity Museonzuki, KTN News, KICC, Nairobi.
Purity Museu bringing us the road to basically just a recap of the Africa Climate Summit, but today we're talking about our road to COP28. And on session with me, I have on my extreme left is Shampi Anna, Kenya Platform on Climate Governance Youth Representative. I also have Susan Otieno, Executive Director, Action Aid Kenya. And I have Bishop Ezekiel Esmore, Director of Programs, All African Conferences of Kenya, and also Non-State Actors Committee. And I have Memory Kachambwa, Executive Director, Femnet, Karibu Sana, and Mr. Charles Waituru, Senior Climate Change Advisor, VSO. Now, I'll just start with Shampi on my extreme left. Now, the voice of the youth is really critical and important when it comes to issues to do with climate change. Even the Africa Climate Summit touched on this and the position of youth to this. Since Africa Climate Summit and on our road to COP28, where do the youth fall?
First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'd also like to thank PACJA for this opportunity. You know, it's mostly in such forums that the voices of the youth get to be heard. So I'm grateful for that. So since African Climate Summit, there have been I would not say it was entirely satisfactory, because there are things as the youth we feel were not addressed or are yet to be addressed. And that is why we are looking at COP28. So for us, the youth, we had really looked at the African Climate Summit with a lot of hope. We expected so much from us, the youth of Africa, and also the leaders that had come to represent us from all over Africa. So mostly for us, it was what lies ahead in COP28, the COP of accountability. What do we as the youth have to do to ensure that Africa flourishes, or rather even our own countries flourishes? So there have been very many efforts. We're running so many campaigns to raise awareness. And now we're talking about accountability. The Keep Your Promise campaign is what is in our minds right now. That we as the youth are saying that we don't want any more promises. We just want to see the promises that were made to our fathers and the ones before that fulfilled. Thank you.
Now, Susan, Action 8. Now, she talks about the position of the young people out there. Now, we know in Africa there is a lot that needs to be done because, according even to statistics, we produce less than 4% of emissions that destroy the climate. And in these then comes the issue to do with loss and damages. Now, as we have this discussion today and on our road to COP28, what should we be focusing on?
Yeah, thank you so much. When we look into loss and damage, we first need to look at Africa as a very special continent. You contribute nothing, but you suffer the most. So when it comes to loss and damage, we are very keen to see what the committee has recommended and what will be adopted, because there are two different things. Always recommendations are very good, and you go in supporting a process in the COP meeting, and at the end of the day, you come out with not even a quarter of the cake. So we are very keen to see that the recommendations that are presented, as well as representation in the committees, will have adequate spaces for Africa. That's how we would like to go into COP28 as we revisit the loss and damage conversations, because we know there are nations that have contributed but have not effectively played their role in facilitating the conversations on coming up with the financing facility. I want to support my colleague, the young person who has spoken about inclusivity. And that was something that the Africa Climate Summit nearly missed, causing the young people to group themselves away from the summit, but crying and speaking voices that they needed to hear in the summit. That was truly uncalled for. The space for the young people ought to be created. It even needed to be created early in advance. Have them prepare, have them come forward, and have them engage. When you look at the financing that was also being fronted, or rather the image that came out in the Africa Climate Summit, was more of private financing. We don't refuse. The American delegate told us, the chief delegate said, that America believes money is with the private people, and therefore they are the ones who will be financing. When we look at it from that point, we are bringing profit at the forefront, and you can never solve the climate injustices by looking at profit. Why am I saying so? We have companies today in Europe, in America, big banks that are financing fossil fuel, even as we talk about de-investing in fossil fuel. And they are the ones who will stand before us as private investors who want to invest in climate-friendly ventures. That does not add up. So we still need governments to be responsible. We need them, in Kiswahili, we say, tunawataka waajibike. And the companies that pay taxes to them, it is the responsibility of these governments to hold them accountable at the end of the day. That way, we will start seeing a balance. Thank you for now.
Now, Reverend, the voice of the church is equally important, mostly because it is your congregants who are affected by climate change. You know, every day someone does not come to church because they don't have food, because there was drought, or now because there is extreme rain and their food was swept away by water that they needed a few months ago. As a reverend and the voice of church in this discussion, and having sat in the Non-State Actors Committee, as we go towards COP, has the voice of the church been considered? And if not, why?
Thank you very much. Let me first of all express profound appreciation to PACJA for organizing such a timely engagement. And even in the religious discourse, we would address this kind of a gathering as a kairos moment. A kairos moment in the sense that it is a moment of speaking truth to each other, holding each other accountable, and addressing those who are responsible for our backwardness, for our retrogression, and indeed the suffocating policies that we have today. Gratitude to PACJA for this, for daring it always to say we would speak, even when the system seems to suffocate us, even when the system seems to conscript us to silence. We choose not to be silent, and we will not be silent. And that is why even as religious constituency, we always identify with PACJA and all other non-state actors. I'm holding a book here that was given to me by Femnet, and I always say I am an advocate to bring about equality in our conversation. And let me also express gratitude to the government of Kenya for daring it to host the first Africa Climate Summit. Yes, Kenya hosts the Made in Africa Climate Summit. We are confronted with the question of whether we have articulated truthfully the aspirations of the people of Africa. We have always said that Africa is a religious continent. You would find Africans in one way or the other professing all kinds of religious faith, even those who claim to be atheists, even those who claim to belong to an irreligious faith. By the thought of being an atheist in itself is a religious faith. Now, if Africa is a religious continent, as it is, there is no just way that the voices of the religious communities, because when you talk about religious community, you are also talking about the youth, you are also talking about the indigenous people, you are also talking about women, you are talking about all categories and ramifications of our society. And that is why for us as religious people, I am not only speaking for Christians or the church alone, but I'm speaking even for those who belong to the African traditional religion, to say that the matter of climate change are matters of life and death. And because they are matters of life and death, they cannot be politicized, they cannot be sensationalized. Truthfulness must be at the center. Hypocrisy must be thrown away, because that is what we have noticed in many climate change negotiation spaces, politics and sensationalization, where truth is relegated to the periphery. And we try to politicize to satisfy the need of those who are in power. Truth must be spoken to them. When we talk about loss and damage, oftentimes it is says, Africa, do you have sufficient evidence to justify that you are being impacted by climate change? What evidence? Who set that tool to determine the mechanism, the level of the impact of climate change on the continent?
And Reverend, I agree with you that when we're having this discussion, we have to speak the truth on issues to do with climate change. And it'll come to your memory as we have this discussion. Now, climate change has been seen to affect women, men as well, and even the youth and the children. But let's talk about women to be specific. As we talk about road to COP28, we know we have had 27 COPs before. This is the 28th COP. Yeah, and even at COP27, we talked about around $100 billion that are supposed to come to developing nations. We're only doing around $10 billion as we speak right now. There's always push and pull when it comes to getting funds to fund loss and damages. Now, these funds are supposed to come to the most vulnerable of the societies that we have today. Now, we know in African societies, it is women who wake up at 4 in the morning to go look for firewood that now the government says you're not supposed to cut trees. So now, as we have this discussion now, women, COP28, will they be heard? Do they have a seat at the table? Or are they, as is being said, left at the periphery to just hear what the creme de la creme of the meetings discuss in those rooms?
Thank you so much. And also just to extend my thanks for PACJA and for the Standard Group. I think the fourth state, the media, is so important, especially when it comes to issues that have to do in terms of shifting narratives. So when we say it's important to center women within the climate justice discourse, it's because in most cases women's voices, but not just women's voices, women are not homogeneous. I think it's important to say at the front line of the climate crisis, we have indigenous communities. We have communities which are being displaced by big multinational oil companies, extractive industries, which really at the end of the day, we know that it's the women who are carrying the burden in terms of the crisis that we face. And this is not recognized, and in most cases, they are not at the table to articulate and to speak their experiences. So you find, and I think Reverend alludes to it, how within COP, it has been framed as a very complex. We are talking of climate finance. We are talking about the 100 billion, and only 10 billion so far has been committed. But how has it been committed? It has been committed in the form of loans. It has been committed in the form of development finance. It hasn't been shaped by the people who really want to be able to use, and the people who are at the forefront. And this is why we are calling and saying, if we are talking about a corp of accountability, the people who must be at the center of shaping, we want a loss and damage fund. How should it come to us? Why should it be hosted by World Bank? Because this is what is being proposed. When we know that currently, even as a continent, Africa, we're experiencing what we experienced before. We know it to come as loan, it to come with conditionalities, it to be going back to the West. So I think it's an opportunity to be able to center the voices of those that are at the front line of the climate crisis and to deconstruct this whole climate finance. I mean, there's so much that has been being talked about. We need to go back, we need to restructure. But as Africans, where are we? We need to actually say, this is how we want to shape it. And I think with the Africa Climate Summit, it was a realization that we are actually the frontier of the transition, if we want it to be just, because we have the transitional minerals, everyone is coming to the continent, but we have not yet really gotten deep down to say, how are we going to frame it? Right now, it's being framed for us. So I think we need to get back our power, and getting that power by centering the voices that matter, the voice of the people, the voice of women, the voice of the youth, the voice of the indigenous, the voice, and in center to that, we need the fourth state to be able to start shifting those narratives, those ideologies, and to really start instilling that back.
Now, Charles, memory has alluded to issue that everyone is coming to Africa. If you want minerals to make your batteries, everyone is going electric, but to get those batteries for, say, Tesla, they need to come to Africa, Congo specific, to get the minerals and take them back there. Now, as climate change advisor, now, how do we have this conversation such that we make sure that Africa sits at the table? That we sit there and say, we are not responsible for destroying the climate. Therefore, this is our position, and you shall not dictate to us how best we will deal with the issues of climate change. Because even now, there's a big word that keeps being thrown around, which is carbon credits. But what's carbon credit? Even as Africa, do we have policies that tell us how much we're getting? Do we have even terminologies to just break down what carbon credits are? Does an Ogiek in Masai Mara understand what carbon credit is? So therefore, as Africa and you as a senior climate change advisor, how should we approach this entire conversation?
Thank you very much, and I join my colleagues in saying thank you very much to the Standard Group and also to PACJA. This is a very needed partnership between us in the civil society and for the state. And if we do this, one of the things we are going to do is we are going to be able to put people at the center. And I think that's what you're talking about. I remember in the last COP that happened in Africa, one of the key things we were asking for is for a COP, a conference of parties, that is for the African people, that puts people at the center, that creates opportunities for the aspirations and the lived realities of the ordinary citizens, Wajiko and the Ogiekis and others down there, to be able to voice their concerns, but not only to voice their concerns, but also for that concern to find itself in the outcome document. And that's where we have failed. We have failed, for example, when we talk about the outcome of the COP, the last COP and this COP, the people and the way they adapt in their lives, because it's the people who are impacted. They are impacted in their health. It's the sexual reproductive health of young girls that is impacted by climate change. It's the livelihoods of our mothers that is affected by climate change. Yet, even the little money that has been put on the table has not reached to them. Why hasn't it gotten to them? And even when we get more, it will not get to them. It does not get to them because, number one, COP has become like a battlefield. It's a battlefield where the mighty, the interest of the profit, is fighting with the interest of the people and the interest of the planet. So for us to be able to move there are things that the civil society have recommended. Number one, create space. Space for women, space for the indigenous people, space for the youth to meaningfully participate. And we can talk about what meaningful participation is all about. Number two, we are saying, let us invest in those pathways that work. Pathways like agroecology. Let us invest in those pathways that are people-driven. And let us reject false solutions. False solutions is things like carbon markets. Because carbon markets, what you are saying is that let the polluter continue polluting, and then somebody somewhere clears that pollution. That won't work. That won't get us to the target that we need to get to. So as the African people, we need now to get to our governments, hold them to account the way we did during the climate summit, because the civil society led by Paksha, we asserted our voice and we said, we moved to the government of Kenya and said, this summit needs to be a people summit. And there are good outcomes there. Let's hold those outcomes and push them forward. Let us assist those interests of the private sector and those pathways that will not lead us where we are. The polluter cannot be the same person who is going to solve the problem of pollution.
And I'll come to you, Susan. I can see what Charles is saying, getting to you. Yeah, I can see you nodding. And as we keep having this discussion, we have actions that we need to do as Africans. You know, we came with the Africa Climate Summit and the Nairobi Declaration came about. But even before we got to that, we had the civil society saying that the entire process had been hijacked by the multinationals. But that aside, we have the Nairobi Declaration as we are going to COP28. We have issues to do. We demand that the way financing is being done to be readjusted. President William Ruto is big on that. But since then and now, are we seeing any movements, or is the Nairobi Declaration another document just on the shelves?
Thank you so much. Let me start by saying that we need to create space for Africa by Africans in Africa. That will guarantee us progress. And meetings such as this gives us that opportunity, because we are able to sit and talk as Africans. Today we are seated here talking as Kenyans. There has to be space that consolidates the voices. Everyone sitting here is representing a constituent. So we have to see how we consolidate our voices. And our voices, even as civil societies, has to go as one voice. No one is in competition. And we have to create that space where we all feel comfortable and we get in. Whether we meet under a tree. I think the sophistication that we bring in, that we need funds to hold a forum or a summit, is what confuses everyone. And when I bring money, I control you. We know how financing has been used to further perpetrate colonialism. We can resist. We resisted colonialism. We ought to resist it even today. in whatever we do, in climate discourse, we have to decolonize the space. When they give the financing, we should be very clear it's a responsibility that they are bearing, the damage that they've caused. So people should be ready. I go back to the word kuwajibika. I pray that that word can become an English word. You have to be responsible. At the moment, what's happening is African countries are being forced to choose between development aspirations and climate actions. And that is why we are being divided on who's giving the money, whose money should you take for what. When an investor comes, he says, I want this money for mitigation. And we are saying even adaptation is not well funded. So as you push us to mitigation, are they adapting? Or should we continue surviving? It's something we have to resist. We can collaborate. We have cooperated. But I think in COP28, the African voice has to be very, very strategic, very clear. The kind of advice, the kind of recommendations that we put on the table, even for the negotiators, has to be well structured. And it has to go in with purpose and impact. But we also need allies. Non-Africans are meant to be allies. Because at the end of the day, it's the same planet. Whether you're in Europe or America or Asia, wherever, the impact is the same. And what we are saying in Africa, we've suffered long enough. It has to stop, and it has to start from somewhere. But it's our voices that we have to put together and pull together. And be very clear. When we are saying, do not finance fossil fuel, do not continue projecting the image of fossil fuel as the way to development. It is not. There are countries that have fuel. Countries in the West Africa, they have fuel, it's flowing. But there is turmoil. Why? Is development with everyone? Aren't people going hungry in those countries? This is something we have to look into. When we are talking about industrial agriculture, we are just saying don't spoil what God gave us. Use friendly mechanisms to produce food. Why would you question the African way of producing food without putting in damaging fertilizer? Is it a must? We ate before, we can eat today without damaging the soil. And that's what we're saying as our voices.
Now, Shampi, as the youth, fine. We finally had a seat at Africa Climate Summit after lobbying. We have that conversation. We're now going to COP28. But locally, as the youth of Kenya, what is our position when we are talking about issues to do with climate? I've had youth before who say, when we meet with, say, government, we are put aside as people who have no expertise, people who have little say to issues to do with climate change. But let's change that narrative, because I keep saying that the youth of today have more time to spend on this earth. Therefore, their position on issues to do with climate change and making it better ought to be on the same seat as those who have experience. Now, as we go to COP28, as negotiators from Africa, negotiators from the world, as youth, what should we be taking to COP? And what message does the youth have for the negotiators who go there?
Thank you very much for that question. So now the youth of Kenya in particular, we are saying that now that name youth is coming as a by the way. We are bringing on the table far much more than just being a youth. That even before saying that we are youth, we're first saying that we're coming in with solutions, we're coming in with mad innovations to solve these issues of climate change. And we're also saying that we're realizing the solutions that you're putting forth are not really working for us. How can over 70% of our monies be going to mitigation while adaptation is getting peanuts? And our real problem is in the adaptation sector. So we are saying that we are seeing these misplaced priorities. We are offering solutions. So when you're relating with us, or maybe you're trying to pitch our ideas, we are imploring not just the government, but civil society organizations. And I thank PACJA for that, because in PACJA you get to be listened to. And not just that. You know, most of the youth in Kenya, and not just in Kenya, I think in the whole of Africa, there is an education gap. Not in terms of literacy, ile ya shule, but literacy in terms of climate change education. Someone is in the university, knows so much, but so little on what is really affecting us. That is the climate crisis that we have. And now, what efforts are being made to educate the youth? And we, the youth, are hungry. We are hungry for knowledge. We are starving. And once we get the knowledge, we want to spread it to our respective spheres of influence. So when we're looking at COP28, we're looking at what knowledge have we gained, and how are we going to impact either our communities or our respective areas of influence. And we are saying that we need space. We want space, not just to be there as youth representatives, but to bring forth solutions on the table, innovations to help solve the climate crisis.
And as the youth, do you feel like Africa Climate Summit gave you the power to speak, the same way a degree gives you power to read?
As Susan had stated, so 3 days prior to the African Climate Summit, we had the African Youth Climate Assembly. And the reason for that is because we felt as if the issues of the youth were not really being discussed. You know, when states are coming together, it is the interests of states that are being put forth. States are very rational. Does this benefit us? Does it cost us? And we end up, you know, discussing issues such as carbon credits, which are false solutions to climate change. I think I'll speak about that later. We're also talking about, you know, other economic benefits, but more so what Susan has said, just discussing the economic sapa juju, but not really focusing on the youth. We have so many problems as the youth. And we're not just coming with problems, as I said. I'm also saying that we're coming up with solutions, that we have identified the problem. We also have solutions, but in order for us to achieve these solutions, we need help. So the 3 days was full on discussing what are the issues of the youth, and not just the youth in the faith-based organizations, the indigenous youth, the youth in the urban areas, the non-indigenous youth, basically every type of youth was just coming on board. And that is where we drew the Nairobi Declaration from. Much of the statements or the demands that have been put forth, you would see benefit the youth. And the importance of putting much concentration on the youth affairs is because we want to secure our future. Right now, it's us that are going to be bearing the consequences of what is happening today, and our children, and the ones after that. So the African Climate Summit did not really cater for that, but we are grateful that at least prior to that, there was the African Youth Climate Assembly that led to the Nairobi Declaration, which we hope is going to be fulfilled.
Now, Reverend, Shampi says issues to do with the youth, it needs to go deeper into that. And that also need to be picked up by the religious institutions in this, yeah? The Africa Climate Summit came, the Nairobi Declaration came. What are some of the wins that we got from that document that we can say we are proud of this, we are going with this to COP28, and for those that we missed in this declaration, we are supposed to correct from the religious point of view?
Thank you very much for the question, and how I wish that that question is also directed at the Cabinet Secretary Toya, if she was here. But however, not only on the part of religious constituency, but also as non-state actors coordinating team. We felt that, yes, the Nairobi Summit Declaration, of course, when you read through the document and you come to the call to action, about 10 points, just like the 10 commandments in the Bible, and you wonder, you say, what is it that is compelling in the document? But as non-state actors, we identify 4 areas that going forward to COP28, and please allow me to read some of the 4 points in quick succession. Number 1, we identify that developed countries fulfill their historical responsibility and provide adequate and predictable finance, technology transfer, capacity building to support adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage in Africa. Number 2, reiterate our position on our rejection of the false solution that seemed to suggest that carbon market is an alternative to climate finance. We rejected that with every fiber in our body. We rejected it. Number 3, African leaders to commit to to a just and equitable transition to renewable energy, ensuring that energy access is prioritized for the poor and marginalized, and that community ownership and participation are guaranteed. This we know. That is where we talk about the destruction of our biodiversity. We are asking for a nature-based solution, not false solution. And number 4, the last point, urge African leaders to stand by the principles of climate justice, human rights, gender equality, and intergenerational equity in all climate policies and action. That's where we talk about the involvement of children, not just only the youth. How often do we hear even the cries of young people, the children of our communities? So it is our responsibility, not just as religious leaders, but as non-state actors, to bring to bear all of this. We are worried that those with political privilege power, whether they will compromise when we come to the table, because oftentimes you will not find some of us on the table because they are fear, you know. If they bring Reverend to the table, he will look at them, no politics. I'm not going to play politics. I am not Kenya Kwanza, I am not Azimio, I don't belong to any other, and I will not belong to any political party. I will not politicize conversation, but it is to speak truth concerning the situation, the things that affects the people. That is our responsibility as not just only religious leaders, but as non-state actors. All of us here, we are committed to speak truth to power. This is the reality. Carbon market cannot be branded as an alternative. We are talking about not just only doubling climate adaptation finance. No, we are talking about doing more. But recently, what are we hearing? That there is even a cut, 15% cut on climate finance for adaptation. And here, Dr. Mitika talked about the mechanism that is being now going to be embedded or domiciled in World Bank. And we know the mechanism for World Bank. How many countries in Africa access funds from World Bank? Why can't we go even the route of global funds for HIV, malaria, and TB, where we have a country coordinating mechanism, where key stakeholders are brought to the table to determine how resources are allocated? This is our call.
And I'll come to you, Memory. The Bishop, rather Reverend, has said a lot that, even Charles alluded to it earlier, that carbon credits cannot be a solution moving forward. But as we talk about issues to do with women, what solution do we have for women out there? As we go to COP28 and the Africa Climate Summit alluding to the fact that we need to talk about all these demographies, putting them on the table and their voice being heard. As we go to COP28 as a coalition of women, as a coalition of the most disadvantaged as we proceed to COP, what are we telling them?
So I think what happened also prior to the Africa Climate Summit is that we actually had the Women and Gender Constituency, Africa Women Gender Constituency group meeting, and we actually consolidated the voice of African women. So the Women and Gender Constituency is a recognized party within the COP. So COP has got different parties. So Africa is the first one to have a constituency to start getting the global to the regional. So we actually birthed that here in Nairobi, and I think that's a win. And we actually came with our demands in terms of what we were also proposing. And I'll just mention what we want to see. So we really want to see accelerated efforts to reduce emission, which is aligned to the Paris goals. We know that COP28 is going to be the end of the global stocktake, which really has missed, and we are so behind. I mean, if you think of all the goals that we were talking about, Paris, I mean, there's been a deviation from the Paris Agreement. So we want to really push for more commitment and more accountability to that. We are talking about the 100 billion. So we are still emphasizing and saying we still want accountability to that fund, and I think in the form of grants, because we have the solutions, like we keep saying. We want it to be flexible. We have mechanisms that have worked before. I think the Bishop has cited some examples. So the reason why it's not like they don't know, it's because we go there. It's a negotiated process. So I think as the Africa group, we need to go there with very consolidated, and we need to really start speaking and making sure things don't move, because we see groups that delay and that subvert the negotiations. So they come prepared just to make sure that there are no decisions. Last year, COP was the first time we had loss and damage as a priority on the agenda. Yet this is something which actually the Africa group pushed for. So I think we have the power, we have the opportunity to also push for climate finance, which is equitable, to provide those solutions. So when we are saying we are rejecting carbon solutions, it's not because we don't have alternatives. There are alternatives. And I think one thing is, as African leaders, we should not be intimidated or shy away from reparations. I think that should be something we should be constantly reminding about, the injustices and the neo-colonial injustices. We cannot shy away from that. And we saw at the Africa Climate Summit, there was like, no, we can't talk of repatriation. No, we should. We should center our conversations on that, because why should the historical injustices be just, we are not the polluters. We are the least contributors to carbon emission. So that should always be a reminder. And we need most of our leaders, when they are in that negotiating space, to really say it's non-negotiable. So I think the African Climate Summit was a start off to, I think we can do better. I think the idea is good for Africa to actually come together and say, as we go to the COP, as Africa, our unique position, we have most of African countries in debt distress. Why do we want to add, when you talk of carbon markets, and we get World Bank to add to the debt distress? Why are we not dealing with the issue? Why are we not bringing the connections? How debt and issues around climate are all the geopolitical issues. We really need to be fronting that more than anything as we go to COP. And for us, as the Women and Gender constituency, we are very clear. We are going there. We are supporting our position, even as non-state actors. So we speak as women, but we also speak with with the agency of, as Africans, what should we be doing?
Memory, you talk about the finance and the damages and loss and damages being an agenda item at COP28, but we'll also remember that it took close to 72 hours for people to just agree on that factor alone, because everyone was pulling on their side. And we're asking if it's indeed true that the world has suffered, that Africa continues to experience the shocks that come with climate change, then why the push and pull? Why can't people just commit to making sure that we change that which has been destroyed? But I'll come to you, Charles, because now you are the expert when it comes to issues to do with climate change. Now, we talk about what needs to be done. Negotiators will be going to COP28 to lay that which is on their table. But we know that 27 COPs later, there are things that have not been achieved. Commitments that have been made have not been delivered. And as Bishop says, as Memory says, we should not be afraid to ask for reparations, because we rightfully must demand that the wrongs that were done be corrected today. As we go to COP, tunaenda kuwaambia nini?
Thank you very much. And
or Or
Yes.
are we going to allow to be cowed because apparently multinationals always have a say?
One thing we must not do is that we must not lose hope, and we must fight. Because as I said in the beginning, the COP, or the Conference of Parties, has been turned into a battlefield. And now it's no longer about the interest of the people, the interest of the planet. It's about the interest of the profiteers. It's about the interest of those people who got us where we are now. And I want to join Dr. Mithika. He mentioned earlier, and this was a great thing that came out of the Nairobi Declaration. The Nairobi Declaration, the African continent joined hands in saying we do not have confidence in the World Bank. And therefore, when we talk about the loss and damage, that must be put in a different institution. So first and foremost, we did ask that the World Bank and the other institutions have to be reformed. In fact, we should not have talked about reforming them. We should have talked about transforming them. And I thank the Nairobi Declaration for that. But as we go to COP, that's one of the messages we must fight hard, so that the loss and damage resources are not put in the World Bank, because that is the wrong place. Then within the Nairobi Declaration, there are things we missed that we need to fight harder when we go to COP. For example, I was disappointed that in a country like Kenya, where universal health coverage is a big issue, in a continent like Africa, where the health burden is so huge, the issues of health were conscripted to the margins of that document. I would have loved to see health coming out stronger. We know that for the first time, we are going to have health issues, and we are going to have a health action at COP, but we need more. We are saying the connection between health and climate must come in a bigger way, because it is affecting the people. We are talking about what we are putting people at the center of the whole conversation. So that is what we must take to COP. We must also reject the issue of forced solutions. And an example, what defines Africa? You know, Africa is defined by its biodiversity. It's about the different types of trees, the different types of plants, the different types of animals, the different types of food that you can put on the table. What is carbon market going to do to our biodiversity? What is the monoculture that they are trying to push on us going to do to our biodiversity? We are going to destroy Africa as we know it today if we destroy our biodiversity. So we must put our biodiversity at the center and be the pillar on which we make the decisions. So when we talk about carbon markets, let's first ask ourselves, how is it going to affect our livelihoods? How is it going to affect our health? How is it going to affect our farms? Thank you very much.
And yes, indeed, this conversation that you're having here is not just about the panelists, but you as well. So if there is anybody sitting there that needs to contribute in this conversation, kindly, there is a roving mic that is going round. Just raise your hand and the mic will get to you. Anybody so far? Looks like the room is happy as we continue having this discussion. But in closing, anybody? Okay, at the back. Can you just introduce yourself and shoot your question?
My name is MC Kaka, and I am the director and the founder of East Africa Campuses and Colleges Green Network. I'm an alumni of Nairobi Summer School, so really shaped me to be where I am today. And one of the big things that I think, basically the outcome of the African Youth Climate Assembly, which was a precursor for the African Climate Assembly, I think having a conversation at African level, and I'm speaking at the position of a youth, it does not make sense to us if we have finances being given to mitigation and yet adaptation is left behind. We represent so many group of people. We represent, indigenous youth who are really providing solutions on climate justice. Most of the things that really matter is basically the people that are on the forefront of climate crisis. It's basically those groups that seems to be neglected out. So having such a forum ahead of COP28 to air out the views and the issues that the African youth are facing in we are saying that we are behind this and we are making sure that our voices count onto this. And actually, I think before ACS, I think we had organized for a march to ensure that we are not going to be misled by giving us false solutions that are going to mislead Africa. And this was one of the harnessing things that we did to ensure that the voice of the African is also count. So I just want to say this, either we are going not directly to participate in COP28, or those who are going to be there, is that the voice of the youth is really dignified, standing strong to ensure that we have that voice counted onto them. And loss and damage dialogue, we have to push to ensure that there is a remedy created to ensure that that fund that we are pushing for is facilitated and the African chapter has received. Thank you so
very much. Next. Kylie, let's make our questions short.
Thank you very much. My name is Douglas. My question to the lady who spoke about decolonizing the climate space, the person who gives you money is controlling you. We're heading to COP28, and one of the things is pushing for these polluters to make sure that they fund for the wrongs that they have done. And how do we make them, how do we push them to be responsible? Remember the Kyoto Protocol, the promises that are yet to, I'm saying the promises which are yet to be honored, the Kyoto Protocol and others. So as Africa, as the global South, how are we going in unity to push and to ensure that they wanawajibika, as you said in Swahili?
Thank you very much.
I think I'll take the last four, and then we proceed.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Victor Okelo, the founder and executive director of We Forest International. I'm the winner of Global Environmental Stewardship Honor by the Rajput and Sikh Foundation in India the other month. So my question goes to the panelists there. I'm here to represent the youths and the indigenous communities like the Ogieks, in that I have a petition that is advocating for the indigenous community at the COP28. I'm advocating for a permanent forum for indigenous communities, and also funding to indigenous communities being the founders, like being the owners of the land, and fighting so much for climate action activations, but we are not being recognized in a platform like this. Well, how can you be of help to us? Thank you so much. God bless you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Kasisi Daniel Wafula. I am a teacher at St. Mary's School, Nairobi. I'm the patron of Environmental Club, SDG Club, and I've worked with the president of that club, as this is in connection with the gaps that are there in reorienting the society, because all these things that you're talking about, it comes with the values that a reverend talked about, talking about the truth. You need to learn how to talk the truth. So the things we are talking about in connection with what my friend has just asked, yes, as those organizations like now the great work that PACJ is doing to create such platforms, how do we maybe make a way of linking, cascading this down so that those who are lowly in the community but rich, fertile soil that can learn and actually grow, being cautious about the environment, not struggle to get such forums. So that before you come to such a forum, you really need to struggle to reach out to the organizations that are championing the same. And I think there is a serious gap if we can create forums, not just for the upper, maybe age set or something like that. How do we inculcate the young people? So I empathize, sympathize with the youth, as they say, but then if the youth are crying, how about the children? So maybe going forward, how can we make annexes or maybe create a network that can work closely with all categories of our community, so that as we look forward to 2030, we look forward to the COPs that are going to come, we are sure that there is a generation that is conscious, that truly takes care of the environment, so that when you tell them we are going to plant a tree as a simple action, the SDG number 13, let the first question not be how much are you going to pay me? So that cannot come until we actually have the children on board. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think we'll take you and all right.
Yes, my name is Dr. Jogu Barua. I come from Joint Environment and Climate Action, which is an NGO based in Kirinyaga County. When I listen to presentations from the panelists, it portrays a very sad position for the African continent. And my view is that if we are not properly represented, we shall not have a voice. And we shall continue in the same situation year in, year after. We are going to COP28. That means cumulatively, that's a minimum of 28 years gone since we started negotiating, and the African issues are not yet properly anchored in the outcomes of this conference of parties. So the question I'm asking is, I'm asking the panelists, how do we raise the African voice in COP28? And I'm asking this because there is a presentation that women had a caucus prior to African Climate Summit, the same case with the youth. Did the issues of the women and the youth enter, or did they get access to the final document? The final question I want to have is that as we are going to COP28, we as Africans must be united. The question I'm asking is, did the African Climate Summit build the African consensus that we need? Did it give us a direction as African that we should move in this way or the other? And the following on that is that if there was an African consensus, in the view of this panel, is that the direction we should take as contained in that document, or there are some amendments or changes that we should know before going to Dubai so that we can be able to lobby for them? Thank you so much.
We shall have those questions for now because we're short of time. We shall take those questions in the second panel as well, so that it can be responded, but the panelists will still be here. But as you've had those questions, I just want you to take note of those questions. But at the moment, let's take this story on the Nairobi Declaration, road to COP in Kenya. Now, how are we going to COP as Africa? What is our position? What are we going to tell the multinationals? Because as we realize, drought is crazy in Africa. We talk about the floods that we're experiencing right now. El Nino is equally tied with issues to do with climate change. But then again, that aside, we are also trying to keep the promise. Pakja is saying that we must keep the promise that we made. Let's just go through those stories as we have the second set of panelists. We shall respond to those questions when we come back after this.
Africa, the cradle of life, a continent of breathtaking beauty, home to unparalleled beauty and untamed wilderness. But beneath this beauty, an ominous threat looms. Our Africa faces an existential crisis. Soaring temperatures, relentless droughts, and punishing storms wreak havoc on our people. The climate catastrophe is ravaging our land, our people, and our future. The numbers don't lie. Africa bears the brunt of climate change, and the toll is staggering. But we, the youth of Africa, we refuse to be silenced. We rise as champions of change, demanding accountability. We aren't just survivors. We are architects of hope, innovators, adapters, and builders of a resilient future. Our leaders have spoken. The world has pledged. Now they must act. Promises must turn into tangible solutions. We are the voice of Africa's future. We stand united, demanding accountability because our very existence hangs in the balance. Join us, share our stories, be a beacon of change. Together, we will hold the world accountable. Together, we will script a new narrative. Africa's legacy will be one of resilience, courage, and unwavering accountability.
continent converged in Nairobi for the Africa Climate Summit earlier this year. The meeting saw several heads of state and different stakeholders engage in what would culminate to be the Nairobi Declaration, a document that holds Africa's position on climate change.
Africa Climate Summit is both a demonstration of the unwavering collective commitment of the people of Africa to their vision to make humanity's first home here in Africa a land of abundant potential.
The document saw African leaders call for urgent action by developed countries to reduce carbon emissions, propose a new financing mechanism to restructure Africa's crippling debt, and unlock climate funding.
The Nairobi Declaration was adopted to be the basis for Africa's common position.
Emissions remain the most important and sensitive issue when talking about climate change, and as such, the world must find a way to address this. Carbon credit continues to be one of the ways to address the emissions issue.
Carbon credits is a mechanism, a market mechanism, to be able to control the amount of emissions in the global space, meaning that those people who are emitting can be disincentivized.
Aside from negotiating for better terms and carbon credits, Africa must push for climate financing, an area that has seen promises made but little to no action done.
Africa getting what it's due to it, almost like reparations in a way. That's one angle, but there's also another angle of Africa coming up with technologies that use clean energy, that are very efficient.
So I think we need to be realistic and tell those countries which are producing the largest percentages of climate change. We need to tell them they need to own up.
The road to COP28 is one that demands that African leaders come together with one voice and present a united front on climate change issues. With the backing of Nairobi Declaration, Africa has an opportunity of finally addressing climate change as a continent and not as individual countries. For KTN News, I'm Dennis Aseto.
And yes, indeed, our road to COP28 as we continue to have this discussion. But before we went for that break, there are questions that had been posed earlier, and we'll just go to our panelists who've just left right now, and let's just respond to the issue to do with the adaptation, loss, and the damage, and also the factor of introducing everybody on this table, including the young people, the very youngest before the youth, like the children in this entire conversation, and how we also have to respond to issues to do with mitigation and adaptation. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. If you allow me, I'll respond to the kuwajibika aspect, yes, because it addresses most of the issues. One of the things that we know is that the technical committee that was looking at the loss and damage they have a report that they are presenting to COP28. And while they are finalizing the report, the US government walked out because they did not want strong sentiments on the financing element. They wanted the term urge. That for me does not bring responsibility. So Africa should go in knowing that we need to speak to the US. We need to be very clear with them that it is not about whether you like it, it's not voluntary contribution. People must contribute. The development countries must contribute. We are not going to evade. Secondly, we are not going to talk loans. That we should not as a continent, concession or otherwise. Third, we declared in the Nairobi Declaration that there is no confidence in the World Bank, but it still is the organ that has been fronted. So we would like to know, after the 4 years, what are the exit clauses? How are we going to exit? And who is going to take over? But also to know that the board that has been recommended has no space for the CSO, has no space for the indigenous people, has no space for the young people. How is this going to be handled? So Africa should be going to COP28 knowing that there is a lot to be conversed on regarding the entire debate on loss and damage. And finally, if all fails, I believe it's time for Africa to now get the UN to just declare climate change an injustice and illegality. It has happened with many other things. These too can happen, so that we start seeking justice and going for our rights legally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. Reverend, briefly?
Maybe just to reinforce what Susan, my dear friend, have mentioned. Article 9 of the Paris Agreement have well articulated what it means, climate finance. Who is responsible? What nations are responsible for contributing intentionally and predictably finances to address adaptation? We are not talking about concessional loans. We're not talking about tokenism. But we're talking about mechanism that demands and addresses historical injustices. We must be shameless as Africans. We must not shy away of demanding for climate justice. And that is where, linking it to the question of how do we amplify the African voices? It is our common unity as a people. The Africa Climate Summit should have provided that space. For example, when we were leaving Sharm el-Sheikh, all of us were excited that the Loss and Damage Fund has been agreed. Whether it is going to be operationalized or not, that is another level of hypocrisy that needs to be addressed. And we are hoping that this will be addressed at COP28. So Africa and African group of negotiators must be truth, must be honest, must be firm, must be bold, and must be confident to bring about the African agenda to the table, or otherwise we should walk away from COP28. Thank you.
And thank you very much. There are other questions. I will ask other questions later. It shall be responded by the panelists here and also the panelists who just left the podium. But joining me as we have discussions on priorities for Kenya and Africa as we gear to COP28 is Charles Mwangi from PACJA. He is the head of programs and research at PACJA. And I have Obed Korigo, Climate Policy Advisor, CARE International, on my extreme left. And next to me is Dr. Male Fofana, Africa Director and Head of Programs, as we have this discussion. But I also just want to recognize Philip Okello, a representative from the Danish Embassy. If you could just wave, Okello, if you're here. All right, and Hannah Wanjiru from the Dutch Embassy as well. Asante sana for showing up. Now, gentlemen, it is priorities for Kenya and Africa as we gear towards COP28. Africa Climate Summit came to Kenya, the very first summit in Africa. I just start with you, Obed, now Climate Policy Advisor at CARE International. Now, it has been conversation surround adaptation and mitigation. Are we approaching this entire conversation the right way? Others want to fund mitigation, not adaptation. Where should we be focusing our energies on?
Thank you so much, moderator, and thank you to PACJA and Standard Group for this session. I think it's really, really commendable to bring these discussions to where they matter, because this is where we are able to amplify the views and the needs of those who are marginalized and vulnerable. Having said that, the previous speakers actually have already set up a good direction in terms of what is our focus. And I want to say that here in Africa, adaptation is our focus. Of course, we may talk about mitigation, which is really important. But when we talk about smallholder farmers, when you talk about pastoralists, when you talk about indigenous groups, adaptation is really at the core. We depend on rain-fed agriculture, and in the recent past we've seen prolonged droughts, which have really wreaked havoc, especially to farmers. We're now seeing a lot of rain, floods, which are, so adaptation really cannot be ignored and should be the core of these discussions when it comes to Africa and Kenya. And of course, it's also worth mentioning that Africa is really disproportionately affected by climate change. We are the least contributors to climate change, yet we are the most affected. And Africa governments are already spending huge sums amount of money to already meet these costs, up to even 10% of the GDP. We're also seeing that many African countries are already prepared plans, national adaptation plans in place, nationally determined contributions, but there is no money to be able to fund these plans, which are already there. So we have also seen pledges. The previous speakers have mentioned about pledges, especially from COP26. We even saw countries promising and committing to be able to double adaptation finance by 2025, but this hasn't passed yet. We haven't seen even a delivery plan on how this is going to be addressed. And last but not least, we've also seen the adaptation gap really increasing, which of course presents an implementation gap, and which is a finance gap. And this leads me to the most recent report that has been released by UNEP, Adaptation Gap Report, which actually says that, if I may read, adaptation finance gap currently stands at $194 billion to $366 billion per year, with adaptation needs likely to be 10 to 18 times more than existing finance flows. And we've also heard that adaptation finance has reduced by 15%, which is really, really alarming. So I mean, looking at the figures and the background that I've provided really paints a stark picture on where we are. And as we head to COP28, really, we need to be really honest with ourselves and ensure that adaptation finance is really delivered, not only doubling, but we want to go beyond doubling of this adaptation finance. Looking at the figures of adaptation gap, really, we need to ensure that we go beyond doubling. We need to see finance reaching those who really need it at the most at the local level. By getting rid of these administration barriers, we need to fund local-led adaptation, and we need to ensure that communities and marginalized communities, women organizations are able to access this funding.
Yeah. And Charles, now, program and researchers at PACJA, according to your research and programs that you guys have been taking out there when it comes to issues to do with climate change, what do Kenyans say? What are the issues affecting Africans that they want addressed as now, and which again forms the basis and conversations that we take to cope?
So much, moderator. I think the Kenyan position is not different from the common African position. Simply because when we go for COP negotiations, Kenya negotiates, within the AGN, or the Africa Group of Negotiators umbrella. And of course, we also within, the G77 and China, are negotiating bloc. So if I may therefore point at some of the critical issues that we're looking for, especially as we go to COP, as the African continent, and Kenya being one of the countries within the African continent, there are critical issues that we've been pushing for a long, long, long time. And what is not very pleasing is the fact that we normally experience, a state of dichotomy in the negotiations, so that it's always Africa versus, our developed countries versus the developing countries, which is not really the direction we are supposed really to actually take. Now, one of the things that we've been pushing for is a recognition of Africa as a region with special needs and circumstances. And our negotiators within the AGN have been really pushing for that position. But for some reasons, it has never even made it to the agenda for COP in the previous COPs. And I think that's a critical issue because if you look at the IPCC data, that is being churned every so often, it's very clear that Africa is one of the continents that is greatly impacted by climate change, and that the situation is not going to change, very soon. In fact, some regions in the continent are already warming beyond the 1.5 degrees. And therefore, that position, we must continue pushing. And if it is accepted as a matter of principle, just like we have common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities principle, I think then every other line of negotiations, every other theme, then is going to align with that particular principle. Because if you look at adaptation, if you look at loss and damage, all of them are supposed to be looked from the point of view that Africa is a region that has special needs and circumstances, and that is based on science. Mm-hmm. But I should also mention that it has been really our position that if we are to maintain or to achieve the 1.5 degree targets, because you don't want to go beyond 1.5 degree temperature rise, then we need significant emission cuts. And these significant emission cuts are not necessarily going to come from Africa, because our contribution is only 4%. So even if we cut our emissions by 100%, that will only account for only 4%. Note, I'm not saying that we should not engage in mitigation, but we are saying we know where the emission cuts must actually be done. Mm-hmm. And we must be very deliberate about that. We require, or we need, to reduce our emissions by 43% by 2030. If we are to keep the 1.5 degree goal alive. And that is going to come from the West. And therefore, if you look at this particular analogy of a leaking house, mm-hmm. you have two options. You may want to continue wiping the water, from the rain, or you may want to repair the source of that particular water, which is the roof. And that's what we need to do. And if you look at the blueprints that were developed by every country, party to the Paris Agreement, the nationally determined contributions, you realize that our NDCs from Africa are so overly ambitious to the extent that they are not even, implementable, so to say. But the NDCs from where the emissions are coming from are less ambitious, and we don't see a lot of commitment in terms of cutting the emissions, from the north. So that is critical, even as we think about adaptation, even as we think about cushioning our people from the impacts of climate change. We must solve the problem of where the leakage is coming from, and that is from the developed countries.
And you raised very pertinent issues. We seem, the world pretty much looks like we are busy just with buckets, collecting water and pouring it outside, but you're not fixing the roof up there. And part of that is because financing does not get to where it is needed. And even if the financing promises have been given, it is always push and pull. Where is this money going to? At some point during Africa Climate Summit, I had a conversation with someone from outside, and they were saying, we find it really hard to give this money to African governments because we are not sure it will be spent appropriately. So some are not giving because they fear African government will misappropriate those funds. But that's a conversation for another day. But I'll come to you, Mali Fofana, now. As we talk about financing, it is a question of this money should come through what channel? African governments saying they don't want this money to go through the World Bank, and reasons have been given towards that. But we have the Africa Development Bank. Should that be an option? And even while at it, how do we make sure that this money does not end up at the Central Bank of Kenya, but gets to the grassroots where this money is needed?
Thank you very much. So as you rightly put, my name is Male Fofana. I'm the Africa Director of the Global Green Growth Institute, which is based in South Korea. And Kenya is in the process of becoming a member of this institution. I think we have to step back a little bit, trying to understand the core of the issues itself. And you have to look at the way that developing countries make their progress, right? They just have three different steps. One is they start with the poverty alleviation and having the right tools, which has been the strategy, the financial mechanism, and trying to reduce the poverty. And then they move to the green industrialization period, right? And different type of tools and strategy and finance. And now they move to the mass consumption, right? And the different strategy. So when we come to Africa, what's happened now is that we ask the African continent to
have the same trajectory, but using one particular policy and strategy or financial mechanism. Doesn't make sense. You cannot solve one tools to different problems. So we need a well-integrated solution, but also well-adapted. In addition to that, you have three different others pressure that's coming. We have climate change, COVID-19, and the conflict in our region. Now the question behind is that the global landscape of financial institutions did not integrate our heart of our economy in Africa, which is the informal sector, right? When you look at, we have 44 million of SMEs that's running Africa, and they produce at least 50% of the GDP. And they require at least $300 billion per year. And they are nowhere in the global finance landscape, because for financial institutions, they are too small, they will not invest in that. The question is, from the African continent, what are the type of financial mechanism we can put in place? That's one. Second, the fact of what is the role of the public sector. I think the government should not sit in the driving seat. That's the private sector. And when you look at the NDCs, most of the financial needs, 60% is more public investment. Shouldn't be the case. There should be the other way around, 60% coming from the private sector. And that required to put in place what you call a financial de-risk mechanism. And that's where we have to push more for domestic finance. And the question I'm asking is, do we need a global loss and damage fund? Why are we not having a local loss and damage fund? What prevents us to having it? That's one question. Second, what are the things that we can put in place to ensure that when we design a national financial mechanism as a de-risk points to attract investors? And the third element is that Africa itself, when it's come to risk, we only have 2 rating agencies. I would not say they have a lot of experience in Africa, but they really not take into consideration the reality. So the rating of the risk is always high, and investors will not like to invest in Africa because of that. There is a lot of conversation around this will help, and I think that was just looking inside the continent, what are the type of solution that we can bring, looking more on the domestic finance. We talk a lot about carbon transaction, but we have the case of Ghana, for example, well advanced in the countries when it's come to regulation. But the point is that there's a huge chunk, I would say, of projects that have carbon potential, but most of international investors say it's too small. So who will fund it? The financial local institution, but they are not ready yet for it. So the question is how we can make sure that we have a holistic approach for entire value chain from the different type of actors and help them understand what role they can play critically in pushing more the own interests of the continent and not looking and expecting something somewhere else. That's the bottom line of the point.
Pretty much Mali is saying that we have to start looking for solutions from within, and I shall come to you as we have these discussion, Obed, now. It is a question of adaptation, loss, and damage. Now, when we talk about loss and damage, we know how it has been a big conversation whenever there is scope of any other conversation on climate change or climate summits that do exist. And then the question comes, if we admit and agree that we have contributed less to destroying the environment, then those that bear the greater responsibility should come through for us, because as we speak right now, the worst drought in over 4 decades, the worst floods in South Africa, in Nigeria, we have cyclones in Tanzania. Now, when we talk about loss and damage at COP28, these examples that we carry with us, how are we placing them? How are we convincing the multinationals, the world, that we need these funds to be able to correct these? Are we also trying to correct these things as Africans ourselves to say this is what we're doing? We just need more help to be able to achieve what it is we want to get at the end of the day.
Thank you so much. First of all, for those who just for the common person who is watching us out there, when we talk about loss and damage, we talk about adverse impacts of climate change that cannot be solved by mitigation or adaptation. They are beyond adaptation or mitigation, and this come as a result of extreme weather events and also slow onset events. And these discussions on loss and damages have really been going on for a long time. And as the previous speakers have said, last year in COP27, we had breakthrough where COP27 established or came up with a decision to establish a loss and damage fund and funding arrangements. And after that, they came up with a transitional committee that was going to look at how these financing arrangements are going to look like. And the COP27 calls for mobilization of new and additional resources to address the loss and damage, particularly vulnerable countries. And when you talk about this, we talked about the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Yes, we are talking about mobilizing internal resources, but we should not forget that there are those who are more responsible, that have historical and current responsibilities to climate change and are causing or contributing to the losses and damage that we are seeing. And it's really alarming to see, as Susan mentioned, that the most recent transitional committee meeting that has already forwarded a recommendation to the COP, come up with a recommendation that are going to be discussed or adopted at the COP. Really, this recommendation really sidesteps the calls by on climate justice by civil society organizations, indigenous groups, and of course, those who are most impacted. The fact that they are proposing that the loss and damage fund is going to be hosted by World Bank really negates the whole sort of idea of having the loss and damage fund in the first place. We're talking about emergency. We're talking about climate urgency. And you know how the World Bank, the procedures of accessing this, and even in terms of loans. We are talking about, as she said, proposing that developed countries being urged, not really being required, but they're being urged or requested to provide funding. And this really negates the whole idea of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So as we go to the COP, we need to ensure that we push back, ensure that the issues that we have been pushing for, especially ensuring that communities, IPs, civil society organizations are also part and parcel of these discussions, including the board. This is how we can be able to ensure that our issues are addressed. We also need to ensure that, of course, in terms of the exit strategy of this World Bank, hosting the loss and damage fund, from previous experiences when already we have institutions already hosting in preliminarily in terms of such kind of arrangements, it may not really provide for an opportunity where probably you can exit. So how do we ensure that they are already, the conditions that the developed countries already put in place are going to be taken into consideration by ensuring that we have a clear exit strategy. But at the end of the day, we want a loss and damage fund that really meets the purpose, really addresses the needs and the rights of communities already suffering from climate change.
Now, Charles, it is a question of Africans also, developed countries being asked to also play their role in addressing issues to do with climate change. And we agree that as much as we say, fine, we contribute 4% but we still contribute at the end of the day. We need to also have discussions around lowering our emissions so that those who've contributed 96% also play their role in that. But as we have, as Africans, and as we continue to have this discussion, how do we make sure that we not only talk about fundings coming here, but we position ourselves such that we also attract investments that will help us address these issues?
Thank you so much, moderator. And maybe just to mention that we've been talking about $100 billion promise, which was a commitment by developed countries, per year up to 2020. The money never came through. But we had COVID, and a lot of money was mobilized really for that purpose. Give and take, if we consumed all the money for COVID-19, how comes President Biden just a few days ago was seeking approval from his government for 115 billion shillings to support Ukraine and Israel in the war? One country, to support the war, in Israel and in Ukraine. Now, what that means is that resources are there. What we are lacking is commitment from developed countries in terms of giving resources that are supposed to support developing countries to cushion their people against the impact of climate change. It might interest you to know that we are already spending on adaptation. Our African governments are spending heavily to cushion their people, knowingly or otherwise. In fact, we are spending 5 times more on adaptation than our health budgets, meaning that we are actually sacrificing our health to support for adaptation in Africa. And therefore, nobody should actually say that we are not mobilizing resources, internally. That is actually happening. But I also think it is very, very, very important, for our developed country partners to actually honor their commitments, in terms of what needs to be done. And it's important to also understand that we are all in one house. It may be having as many compartments as the continents we have. But if you have a house and one of your sons seated in one of the rooms smokes bangi, for example, marijuana, the smell will be felt across. That particular will be experienced across the entire house. So therefore, by supporting Africans to adapt, does not necessarily mean that somebody else is actually losing from their end. The challenge is that people have been thinking that mitigation is the only avenue, that can actually attract investments. And that is why 75% of climate finance is actually focused on mitigation actions. It's actually mitigation centric. And only 25% is going for adaptation. But research has shown that even investing in adaptation can actually be a good business kind of proposal. It's possible to invest in adaptation and still get some resources, some profits out of your investments. But I think that is what so that investors can also find value in investing in adaptation. In fact, for $1, I'm told, but I think we need really to also package our proposals, our adaptation proposals, in a way that they also attract investment in the continent.
Mali, now, as we talk of the international community finding ways to fund issues with climate change, be it mitigation or adaptation, it is a question of what is being done locally, and also a question of mushing support from within, say, the private sector. But that notwithstanding, we recognize that the shocks that Africa continues to face today is as a result of what has been done over hundreds of years ago. So now then, what is the responsibility of those that destroyed the environment, and what stake do they have in making sure that we restore the place we are in today, that we don't go past 1.5 degrees, and that even when Africans are demanding for funding from them, it is not because it is not because we just want to spend this money, but because we want to correct that which was done unto them, and also just make the world those live in a better place for them as well.
So I think the point is, at this moment we speak, like, every home is burning, right?
Thank you.
So you cannot just wait and say, okay, I will wait my neighbor to just go grab water for me, right? You will have to go and just serve yourself. And that's the point as well currently that we are, because the developing countries, they have their own priorities in their agenda. And one for the Africa, especially for the adaptation, is a minor priority in a sense, right? And the point is, as you rightly put, mitigation was kind of a business model that is easy to have the return of investment. Adaptation is hard to sell because you have the social benefit in, right? But I think the point is on in our push for that, I think it's quite important to look at it on Africa perspective, how we can have our own solutions. Of course, we can claim what, need to come back to Africa, but at the same time, how we can build our own pathway by working with our local private sector. And that's the only way that we can, because our economic structure is totally different of economic developing country structuration. You will not talk about informal sector in developing countries. And our informal sector are driving our economy. So how we can make sure that we build a business model, we have an economic model, that integrate that part. And that's why within GGI we have what we call the green growth model that integrate that sustainability, the informal, but also all that's linked to the different element and helping that with the merge of green index. So what I want to say in all is that we have to rethink our business model as for now and trying to make sure we look how the economic model that we have take into consideration our reality, not the global landscape. The money is still there. And for the agriculture specifically, which is one is really driving the economy and tied to adaptation, how we can put what I would call the de-risk mechanism and give enough space for the private sector to go for PPP, but also South-South collaboration.
Mali, I would want to just throw something into the wax and ask, when we talk about issues to do with the climate change, it is climate action activists would say it is not a question of profits. It is a question of humanity putting our face to issues to do with climate change. Therefore, how do we have this conversation from that global level such that we debunk the fact that when we talk about climate change, it's about profits first, but humans first?
But for me, climate change is a business. That's how private sector have to see it. And that's the language they want to hear. Climate change, in reality, is the business. How you can transform like industry that want to move to a classic industry to go to the greener one to increase the profit is a business. So you have to look at the challenge as also like opportunity from the private sector perspective. And that's that transformative shift that we have to make from because speak the same language for the private sector. So for me, in a nutshell, climate change is the business. Now, the cost benefit or the social benefit behind, we can discuss that later, but it's a whole package, but there's a way you're selling it. When you talk to the private sector, you say climate change is the business. When you talk to donors, you have different social benefit aspects, so there's a way you're seeing it from the point of view.
Now, very well. I'll come to the plenary right now and just ask anyone who has a question on issues to do with financing. Roaming mics will go. Please make the questions short because we're short of time, so short and sweet. Yeah, 1 minute question as we proceed.
Thanks. My name is Juliet Oluoch. I'm a programs manager with USDI, that is Udgon Sustainable Development Initiative. And I have a question to our panelists. And thank you so much for, the enriching discussion. Thank you so much for the enriching discussion. So on the question of loss and damage, and I totally agree with everyone here that we are all mad at the West, for not fulfilling their promise. But my challenge and what I would like to hear from the panelists, what is your opinion in terms of our preparedness to receive this money? Do we have our structures in place? Are we ready to actually operationalize this money? Should we get it? I mean, should they sign it off in COP28, for example? If you allow me to ask just
let me
a
give someone else
question.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. And my second question was on evidence. We are, I'm a researcher as well, and we rely a lot on evidence produced by the West. And my challenge is, and thanks to PACJA for bringing to these sectors, but how are we making use of our research think tanks? Are they actually providing us with the evidence that we need to sit in negotiation tables? What is the source of evidence for our CSOs, for our media? We've had cases of misreporting very often times, so I would also like to get that from you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Eve Merin. I work with a community organization called Nkakenya Sidai. Dr. Resilient and what have you? That's my first question. My second question is, yes, thank you. How do we how can we strategize the community-based organization led by the women who are the most affected by the effects of climate change for funding? And my last question, please, the last one. From the African Climate Summit that happened a few months ago, it is true that the West were focusing on carbon credits. Down in our villages, that is the conversation that is so loud, more than the adaptation of how to, how do we work with the effects of the previous drought that wiped the livelihood of the community. But that one is not hard. What we are hearing is the carbon credits. how do we reduce that voice and amplify our voice? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nashkuru. Kindly, one questions as we proceed. Make it short.
Thank you very much. My name is Ruth Gesho. I work for Pathfinder International. I think I want to add my voice to the carbon credit discussion. You realize that the horse has bolted. And even as we discuss here, already, example, our Kenya government have already signed into law the carbon credit trading. So are we speaking to the right people? Do we have the right people in the room? Are lawmakers aware of the impact of the laws that they have put in place? How do we move from here? Now that the law is in place, we are already exploring, so what happens? And just a quick one on young people involvement. I wanted to ask, yes, where are the children? The discussion of we need to involve the youth. My daughter asked me, if climate change is that important, why is it not being taught in school? Why are we not involving the health, not the health, the education sector in this discussion? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Pakja, for this very, very informative session in the Standard Group. My name is Dr. Juliet Kimemia. I'm wearing two hats. I'm here with the Executive Director of Dedan Kimathi Foundation. This is a foundation that is really doing vitu kwa ground. You know, I've heard everybody here talking about demands, what we are taking to COP. But if we do not interact with those organizations that are interacting with climate change at the community level, we may just end up just listing down demands. So my strong proposal is, can we hear success stories on how climate mitigation, climate adaptation is happening at the ground, how intergenerational dialogues are happening on the ground. Dedan Kimathi is working in 21 counties. Within the work, there are very many schools, there are very many communities, there are very many young youth groups, there are very many women groups, all working at community level. Can we hear the voices of those who are doing it practically? And the financing then needs to be mobilized around apex organizations like Dedan Kimathi Foundation. The second one, the second hat, please allow me, because I was doing that for somebody.
We'll take that later, a bit later, because we have another session.
Let me talk about what he has talked about, business models. We cannot achieve any progress if we don't look at addressing climate change from the economic eyes. So I am consulting for the Kenya National Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and we have in our list very many investors from outside the country who are ready to finance climate action, especially solid waste management, and things to do with plastics, things to do with nature-based solutions. So we need to engage on that. Otherwise, the loss and damage funds, the 10 billion that has already been released, will just go to maybe financing meetings like these ones and not getting to the
Thank you very much. I'll take the final question.
Okay, my name is Venta Mongera. Thanks so much for the group that has put together this event. I think it's a timely discussion that is not too late, still not too early, but better to have it now than later. I'm alluding to much of the discussions and reflections that have already been said in regards to what we are discussing. One key point that I'm emphasizing to us is we cannot trust the same mind that created the problem that we are in today to give us a sustainable solution that is responsive to our issues. Obviously, it will be feeding to their secret agenda that is, of course, now going to destroy us continuously and silently. So what is our 2-3 points that we are suggesting that we are taking to COP in regards to the alternative way that we would want the climate financing to be done and not the World Bank. Of course, we know about the loan, we know the rates and all that. What is our suggestion apart from, yes, we don't like it, what do we like? What is the alternative that we are giving them? Number two, I have two more points, brief ones. What are we suggesting as a sustainable framework that will support youth? Because we are talking about not leaders of tomorrow, but leaders of today. What is it that we are putting on the table about the youth, about women? We know women, they receive seed, they give us food. What are we giving them? What is that sustainable framework that we are putting in place so that now we can ensure the future that we are looking at is better prepared today for a brighter today and tomorrow? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I think I'll come back to the plenary. Can you allow me them to respond to that? We'll take other questions a little bit later. Let me just come to you as you respond to issues to do with climate adaptation. We talk about the fact that we can't trust those who created the problem to fix our issues. And finally, how do we make sure that this message actually gets to their children, gets to the women there briefly as we close the session, please?
Thank you so much. I'll quickly respond to the issue of evidence and simply say that we already have the evidence. The evidence is there. Of course, what we need to improve on is the documentation of this evidence, but we have the evidence. And in terms of ensuring that these issues are already highlighted out there, so of course, want to sort of resonate with what she has said. We need to bring more voices from the ground, so that they can be able to speak these issues in the language they understand best. So amplifying the voices from the ground is really, really important. Even as we go to COP28, how do we ensure that we bring grassroots women, we bring indigenous people, pastoralists who are already affected and be able to speak these stories in the language that they understand the best. Then in terms of how prepared we are, give an example of Kenya. Kenya is already has policies, plans in place. We have already NAPS, we have the NDCs, we have the climate finance sort of infrastructure in place, including county climate change financing mechanisms. So what we need is the money. We already we have the relevant mechanisms to be able to access the funding that we need. Of course, what is required is now operationalizing this fund, operationalizing the institutional framework, including the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, that is still not yet operationalized. But of course, having said that, I also wanted to say that the issue of global goal and adaptation is very, very important. Countries are still negotiating on how to measure or progress on adaptation, for instance, the metrics, the indicators. This is really, really important. And for us to be able to make progress on even the evidence and even quantifying the amount of financing that is required, we need to make progress on how to measure adaptation progress in order to be able to achieve the global goal on adaptation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Now, regarding I hope this is better now. So regarding research and whether we are doing enough, I want to say in Africa, we are not funding research. We have not taken very seriously. And I think it's about time that we generated our very own data that we can actually own. If you look at IPCC and the contributors to IPCC, the African contributors are very, very few. But having said that, we have so much gray data that we have been able to produce through studies that are not necessarily published. And I think it's about time that we utilize even that gray data and that we advocated for use of such data to also inform global processes. Allow me to also mention something about carbon credits, because I think it's an issue that has actually been discussed so much, and somebody's mentioned it's now the topic, on the crowd. This is what you're saying. The carbon markets were actually introduced, through the Kyoto Protocol, Article 12, where we had the clean development mechanism. Clean in the sense that we supported countries that were called Annex 1 countries, the polluters, a leeway, to actually pay the poor countries like Africa so that we can create room for them to dump their mess, and that is the carbon emissions. Now that has not been anchored at Article 6 of the new now Paris Agreement. And that is why the convention around carbon trading is happening. But think about it this way. A poor farmer who needs to take his child to school, and he has a cow being the only property he has. Here comes a rich neighbor who comes and dictates the price for that cow and buys that cow at a throwaway price simply because the poor farmer needs money to take the kids to school. That is how I can summarize the carbon markets. So in Africa, our carbon, tons of carbon equivalents, our credits are being bought at a very, very low price, which is not commensurate to the investment that we put in producing those tons of carbon equivalents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mali. As you just make it brief on how we can trust those who destroy to change the situation.
I mean, trust should be there, but also you have to verify. That's the second part, but not waiting also what they committed to. And that's why we have to push more our internal solution. Okay, of course we talk about with the biggest loss and damage fund, but the question again is what prevents us to have our own national loss and damage fund? And that's a big question that we should ask, because once there is a climate hazard, you have the population that have issues, the funding of the loss and damage go to them. But what happened with the SMEs? Who will cover that part? And the SMEs, informal one, they are driving the economy. So it's a good point to look at as well.
Is on that note that let's just take a short commercial break. When we come back, we go to Mr. Mithika Mwenda as he gives us the overview of everything and a vote of thanks as we come back and also continue with these conversations. But now let's just take a short commercial break and also a health break. We shall be back in a few.
KTN News. Get the whole story.
How do you keep your toilets clean?
I use normal detergent and bleach for washing.
The detergent and bleach cleanless can leave behind yellowness, rust, and germs. Harpic's 10 times better cleaning compared to regular detergents and bleach, and kills 99.9% illness-causing germs in your toilet, including the COVID-19.
Whatever was done by our forefathers, what we are doing now as we seek to progress economically and socially has had an impact. But we bury our heads in the sand. We are living in a threatened climate that is now fighting back. We are losing not just the battle, but the entire war against Mother Nature. Fortunately, KTN News is taking the bold step to speak it and do it.
Na mimi ni mwanahabari wa michezo. Huu ni mwaka wangu wa 17 katika shirika hili la Standard Group. Tunapenda michezo kwa sababu tunapeperusha bendera ya Kenya kama mabalozi tu, yani tunatumia